Good day, everyone. This is Louis Perkins. I'm the president of the Apparel Impact Institute. And today I'm joined by a group of colleagues and peers in the climate work for the textile, apparel, and footwear sectors action in reducing CO2 emissions reduction. So we're going to tell you more about that today with the report that we have co-created at Apparel Impact Institute with the World Resource Institute, the Roadmap to Net Zero, delivering science-based targets in the apparel sector. And as I open up this group, I'd like to introduce my colleague and friend, Michael Sadowski. Michael has been working with not only WRI, but also Apparel Impact Institute over the last few years in developing and researching and presenting this report. So with that, Michael, I'm going to turn it over to you to give an overview, specifically today focused on the deep dive into energy.
Excellent. Thank you, Louis. And if you could advance the slides. So I'm going to tee up the conversation here. We have some amazing panelists. Liam Salter from Reset Carbon, Kurt Kipka from the Apparel Impact Institute, Manuel Baigorri from Levi's, and Abhishek Bansal from Arvind. They will speak in about 10 minutes and share their perspectives. They're really expert perspectives on how do we decarbonize the apparel and footwear supply chain. I will tee up the conversation with a few minutes on the work that we did with Louis and team on the Roadmap to Net Zero. So if you could advance the slide, please. Okay, so just for some context, and this is the third and final webinar that Louis and I have done with WRI and Aii. So we're going deeper into the energy side of the interventions, but this really all started about 3 years ago in June of 2019 when WRI published guidance for the apparel sector to set science-based climate change targets. At the time, companies were setting targets that were inconsistent, that were not necessarily science-based, and there was a desire to bring more consistency and clarity into the target setting process for climate change. And so we launched this report back in 2019. If you could advance to the next slide. I think everyone probably is now well aware of what we mean by science-based targets, but in brief, they are corporate climate change targets that are in line with what science tells us is required to keep temperature increase to no more than 1.5 degrees C. About a month ago, the IPCC came out with a new report on mitigation. And in brief, they essentially reiterated our collective challenge that we have to peak emissions by 2025, we have to have emissions by 2030, and then we have to achieve net zero emissions by no later than 2050. This is not just apparel and footwear, this is the global economy. This is a massive undertaking. It's really fundamentally changing every sector, every human activity on the planet. So this is enormously challenging. It's not just challenging for footwear and apparel companies, it's challenging for the global economy. So that's our collective challenge, and that's what we mean by science-based targets. So when we started this work 3-4 years ago, there were maybe a dozen companies with science-based targets. We're now well over 200 actually, and so you can see just a sample of those companies on the list. It used to be primarily Western brands that were setting and committing to targets. You now have global brands, regional brands, manufacturers, material suppliers. So it's really exploded in terms of the interest. And so with that, we thought it was critically important to define what it's going to take to actually get the apparel and footwear industry to deliver against these ambitious goals. So great momentum, but we worked together with Aii to really map out how do we get there. So next slide. So with generous support from Loudest Foundation and input from quite a few stakeholders, Aii and WRI joined together to publish a report called the Roadmap to Net Zero. We did so back in November. Again, it really lays out the how do we get to net zero. The guidance was, how do what are the targets? What do you have to reduce to get there? So in this report, we worked with SAC, HIG, and Textile Exchange data to come up with a fresh estimate of sector emissions, which we found to be just over a gigaton or 1 billion tons of CO2 equivalent, and that unchecked emissions will grow to roughly 1.6 gigatons by 2030. And then we identified a number of interventions that are needed to get a good way towards that goal. So the roadmap is live. You can read it on the website, and we'll come back to that. But if you can advance the next slide. So importantly, we weren't the first entity to come out with an estimate of sector emissions. And I think this question of what are the emissions of the sector, to be totally candid, we don't know for sure, and it really depends on the author's assumptions and data sources. You can see some of the reports that have come out before us, starting back in 2017 with the Ellen MacArthur Foundation and McKinsey. And then McKinsey did another report with Global Fashion Agenda 2 years ago. And then there's a Qantas report. So you can see the range is, maybe on paper doesn't seem so great, but 2 to 7% is actually a pretty decent range. So the way we think about this is that we came out with our fresh estimate based on what we think is the most used and best data set that we have. It's not perfect data, so we're very mindful of not coming out and saying, the apparel sector is definitively X%. We have a reasonably good estimate that we'll talk more about in a moment. So next slide, please. So, again, roughly a gigaton of emissions from the sector. One thing that's consistent across the studies is that they find that the hotspot really sits within tier 2. So knitting, weaving, dyeing, finishing, that is a good portion of the sector emissions. A good portion of that comes from thermal energy, which is combusting fuel directly for heat for things like dyeing and finishing. More difficult to decarbonize than electricity in many places, but the reports are fairly consistent in seeing that tier 2 is a hotspot of emissions. Tier 4 activities such as cotton farming, extraction of oil and gas to make synthetics is another key hotspot. So despite the data overall being varied, there's pretty good consistency around where the hotspots lie across the value chain. Next slide, please. I mentioned earlier that the data is imperfect, and so in the report, again, we were very clear that this is our best estimate. It's a starting point, and over time, we believe that the Higg index can actually be used to compile primary data for more pieces of the value chain going forward. We know the Higg is not perfect. We know there are gaps, and we know that if we want a better estimate over time, we need more primary data and higher quality primary data. And the Higg FEM over time can be used to pick up more pieces of the value chain to get that primary data. So again, we're working with imperfect data. We feel like it's the best we have, and over time we see a vision of more and more data coming through the Higg FEMs, that we're getting that primary data. So in the future we have better estimates. So next slide. We identified 6 ways to reduce emissions. Maximizing material efficiency, so making the same product with fewer inputs, scaling sustainable materials and practices, things like recycled polyester, organic cotton. These are materials that we know that we're using. How do we dial up the use of these? Investing in so-called next generation materials, so things like textile to textile recycling. And then on this call, we'll really talk about the last 3 interventions on the energy side. So how do we significantly increase efficiency in facilities, energy efficiency, which has the benefit, of course, of saving money. How do we get out of coal in thermal energy use? And then how do we shift towards renewable electricity? So we'll focus our conversation on those 3 today. Next slide. The numbers on this chart are a bit small, but as you can see, we kind of mapped out business as usual trajectory. So as I mentioned earlier, we're, if the industry keeps growing at the same rate, so roughly 3%, we will blow past our carbon budget. We've got to get down to about 0.56 gigatons. If we keep growing, we'll be at 1.6. And so in this report, we've identified these 6 interventions that can show us what's possible. As you can see, electricity is a big lever that we'll talk about on this call, as is eliminating coal in textile mills and manufacturing facilities. So we We know the levers. Again, this is another area that the other reports are pretty consistent. So we roughly know where the hotspots are. We know what the levers are for reducing. The data isn't perfect, but that shouldn't stop us from investing in things like energy efficiency and fuel replacement and renewable electricity. So I think I've got, yeah, if you could just hit advanced 2 more times, perfect. So I'm not going to go into these. We'll hear from our panelists about you know, some of the opportunities and the barriers to each of these things. You know, on our last webinar, we got asked like, hey, which is the easiest thing to do of all the 6 interventions? And that's a tough question because I think every one of these has some technology barriers, some policy barriers, some economic barriers. There's a mix of these, you know, kind of systemic challenges to each of these things. But I think that as our panelists will share, some of these interventions are more ready to go. And I think we'll hear more about, you know, things like energy efficiency. And then investment is needed longer term into things like finding substitutes for coal. So we will hear more about that. But if we can advance to the next slide, and I think that is it for me. Louis, I think you are going to maybe tee up this
great.
This section.
Yep.
So there we go.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.
Yeah, Michael, thank you so much for the overview. And I think, you know, what the key points that as we walk through this is, you know, the directional information that we've been able to get, the insights from these reports. And for those of you who haven't listened to the full overview of the report, there's 2 previous webinars, one that was on the full report, and then a deep dive into materials. So please check those out as well too. But with that, what I'd like to do is present our panelists that are with us today. I'll introduce them, and then I have some questions that we've prepared to dive in a little bit with each of them. Please use the chat, I'm sorry, not the chat feature, the Q&A feature rather than the chat for your questions. And Michael and I are going to be scoping those as well to ensure that we're addressing some of the key issues coming from the group. So first of all, I'd like to introduce the panel, which is today we have Liam Salter from Reset Carbon. We have Kurt Kipka from the Apparel Impact Institute. We have Abhishek Bansal from Arbon Limited, Arbon Mills, and Manuel Baigorri from Levi Strauss and Company. And I thank you all for joining us today. So with that, I'd like to, you know, as we discuss a little bit more of some of the findings and the recommendations from the report, we do have these experts with us. So Liam, I'd like to kind of open it up with you. First of all, for those of you who don't know Liam, you should. Leah's been working in the space for a long time and has been such a strategic and key partner to first the Clean by Design initiative and now within Apparel Impact Institute to our total organization. Liam, welcome. And can you give us a little context here as you review the report? Can you give us some examples of some of the key energy interventions that were highlighted and how that's playing out in some of the work that you're doing and why they're critical components of this report findings?
Yeah, sure. I think starting to get some much more granular insights into the sort of the reality of the reduction potential of different measures from the work that we're doing with the Apparel Impact Institute on carbon leadership program. So carbon leadership programs really been focusing on wet processing sites because, as we've sort of discussed already, that's a major hotspot. So definitely, you know, wet processing sites are a priority for most brands when they kind of run the numbers and decide where they want to focus. We've got about 130 sites in the program now, kind of got data back on action plans and targets from about 100 of those sites. So it's starting to give us some pretty rich insight into the opportunities. Maybe just to give you some sort of headline figures from that. The action plans which we're developing with the mills, we're establishing a sort of an average reduction potential by about 2030 of around 45% per site. We are seeing that mills are sort of willing to try to implement around 30–35% of that by 2025. So that kind of initial chunk is something that a lot of mills are willing to commit to with the balance sort of left longer term. When we look at where the reductions come from, we see broadly, the three categories that have been outlined in the report roughly seem to balance. So energy management, which often comes in at a fairly good return on investment. Coal phase out, which is certainly in some cases going to be quite expensive. And renewables procurement, mainly from off-site renewables. So that's sourcing it externally from either a utility or an independent power producer or something like that. These are the three big options, and they're roughly balancing each other out to contribute to that 45%. The biggest one is probably coal phase out. So if we're looking at what is providing us with a very, very immediate food for thought, a very big priority that's kind of reflected back in the way the brands are responding to this data, it's that coal phase out's a very big one because it requires the fewest sites to be engaged to deliver it. So that's definitely come out as a priority from the numbers from Carbon Leadership Program.
Great, Liam, appreciate that overview. And I think that, the key point that we think about too is the interventions that exist and are proven and that we know we're ready to get started on, and then those where we may have some innovation gap and where there is an opportunity for us to dive in, particularly as a collective of the industry rather than individually. And so I don't know if you want to comment on that at all in terms of existing versus.
Yeah, this 47% is all existing, right? So this is, our engineers going to the mills and, what can we do, guys, and what's affordable and what's investable. So I think this is all that, and it's not enough, right? So 47% is not enough, but this is what we can get from what we can see early in the decade from technologies and measures that are broadly investable. So I think that's relatively good news. Now what we've got to go and do is actually go and do it.
Yeah, that's great. And I kind of always want to highlight that because I think there is this perception sometimes that, too much has not been figured out and we need to, and we're waiting on some level of, intervention or something, but clearly this work has proven and your work has proven that, there is a tremendous amount of benefit from getting started on the efficiency side as well. With that,
absolutely.
I think
it's very clear where we need to go immediately. That's for sure.
Exactly. And it's a dual track really, because it's a both and, which is what I want to tee over to Kurt Kipka. Kurt, thanks for joining me. I have the benefit and privilege of working with you daily at Apparel Impact Institute. You've been in this space leading the Clean by Design initiative from the NRDC side. And then as NRDC transitioned this program over to AII, you've taken this leadership on as well as other leadership with our climate work at AII. So thank you. And tell us from your perspective, maximizing energy efficiency, step one, why is this in the Clean by Design program, sort of a great starting point? And then, how does it evolve and what benefits do you see that facilities can take from doing that work to a more holistic sort of continuous improvement that addresses all three of these areas?
Thanks, Lewis. I think Liam teed it up quite nicely, actually. Clean by Design is now a more than decade-long program that offered a starting point for facilities to begin an energy efficiency and water efficiency program, kind of looking at, what are the first things that a facility can do in a 12-month or 18-month cycle. What the Carbon Leadership Program that Liam described represents is the evolution of more sophisticated and long-term planning associated with that foundational program that NRDC started and AII has continued to bring forward. The reality is, even within the report, the efficiency numbers may be understated. And in fact, I feel that they likely are understated based on the data that we've seen from facilities within the program, which Liam described. And so there still continues to be untapped potential just on having improved management systems, efficiency, or more efficient technology in production facilities. It's really just a matter of ensuring that across tiers, both starting in tier 2, as Liam mentioned, as the kind of hotspot within the industry for energy efficiency reductions, but then using some of those methodologies to expand into other tiers for efficiency programming that can be cross-tier and ultimately cross-sector as well, extending outside of the apparel and footwear sector for the kinds of interventions that are going to be most beneficial in manufacturing. Just like if we're in a home, or we as individuals are looking at installing new technologies like solar on rooftops, for example, the first place to start is to make sure your house is in order, that you're operating at the most efficient level as possible. The same goes for the thermal energy challenge that this industry has. If we can reduce the need for thermal energy with more efficient systems and processes, we're shrinking the size of the need for some of these more carbon intensive activities that the industry ultimately has to target and begin to retrofit. So even though it's the opportunity that's right there, and I know Michael said that you can debate on what's the easiest to implement, efficiency is there. As Liam pointed out, there's proven, tried and true technologies and activities that facilities can bring forward, but also that brands can deploy in the form of programming, partners with long-term experience in this space that can begin to make very, very meaningful progress towards achieving science-based targets and similar carbon-related goals within the supply chain that start with efficiency and expand into more sophisticated retrofits as well.
Thank you, Kurt. And as I'm listening to you talk, I'm thinking about a little bit of the timeline of all this work. And, you know, years ago, when Clean by Design was being launched, we really talked about it as like the gateway. Like you start with this evaluation of understanding, you know, where you can begin to lower your energy and thermal use through these efficiency programs. But now, through AII and Reset partnership, and this Carbon Leaders Group, there's an opportunity to kind of get started even a little bit earlier to evaluate. And so I thought I might just kind of make a little plug for the Carbon Tech Assessment that Reset developed and has been working with you, Kurt. And I thought it'd be interesting to hear about how that now has become sort of this initial lens for getting started with facility evaluation. Perhaps you and Liam both could chime in on the Carbon Tech Assessment work.
Sure, I'll get us started and then turn it over to Liam. Glad to do it. And again, yeah, Reset has been a fantastic partner, as has Levi's and Arvind, who are represented on this call. The tech assessment is an example of how we within programs, not just within AII, but at an industry level, are beginning to look at carbon reduction potential in a longer term version of that work. Again, historically, within the Clean by Design program, the view was, what can we accomplish in a specific term, a given time frame? Now we're still looking at what's realistic for a facility to achieve in a 1 year, 2 year, 3 year increment, but also having a long-term view of what the ultimate savings potential for that facility may be and what the most prioritized projects may be for that location, given a snapshot in time with engineer to engineer engagement early on in that assessment and engagement process. Liam, anything you would add to the success and development of that process thus far and how it's beginning to drive the implementation projects that we're bringing forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think Carbon Tech Assessment is it's almost like the next level of data down from FEM. And it was, you know, built by our engineers and AII's engineers because we wanted to rapidly understand a bit more about the maturity of the facility, because we didn't want to go and talk to them about stuff they've done already and kind of waste their time. So that's kind of where it came from. And so it's like an engineering questionnaire. It can be deployed really quickly. It costs like $600 a site. We've done about 400 of them in the last 18 months. And it just gives us a really quick insight into, you know, where that facility is and where they are on some of the key reduction options. So it's really good for kind of mapping out a portfolio and understanding the rough, you know, whether you're a manufacturer and you've got a portfolio yourself, or you're a brand and you've got a large sort of supply chain portfolio. It's a really good way to just go and get some initial insight, which you can use to develop some priorities around. And I would say, you know, it's freely available, so you can email Kurt or myself and we'll send you a copy and you can have a look at it. So we just found a lot of people using it as a first step to get a read on the situation before they then kind of plunge into the details. So it's been very helpful from that perspective.
Thanks for mentioning that, Liam. That's one thing that's worth clarifying here. When we say our or we say we, it's referring to the industry. These tools, the Clean by Design program, all of the underlying resources, materials, the CTA, the Carbon Leadership Program, all transparent, publicly available resources. It just happens that we're piloting and bringing them forward together with a number of partners, but ultimately they're readily available both within this industry and perhaps applicable to other industries also.
And question for Liam, is it only useful on top of the FEM and HIG data, or have you been able to apply the carbon tech assessment with other data sets?
It's better with FEM, but we can use it if we don't have one, because not everybody has FEM. So you know, I think it's flexible, but it's always better to be building off FEM if we've got it.
Yeah, and I think that's just important to highlight. Even in the report, we highlight that while, you know, data sets aren't complete or aren't perfect, that we want to invest in the industry's adoption of, you know, common data sets. But I think it's good to note that if brands are getting started and they have other data sets, there's the potential they don't have to wait. They can reach out. So I'm making a little bit of a plug for tools and programs, but I think it's important to kind of understand what's out there. But then how is that really being applied within the supply chain? And so Abhishek, I'd love to get your experience. Arvind Mills has been a really strategic leader in sustainability and in the apparel sector, textile apparel sector. What is your approach as a company to these types of interventions? And as you read the report, you know, how does that apply to what you're doing? And then tell us a little bit about some of the challenges that you've seen with the work.
Thanks, Luis, and hi everyone to all the attendees. Luis, as we see, we occupy a large width within the whole supply chain. So we are there from fiber spinning to whole weaving, knitting, dyeing operations, and also garment making in some cases. So we occupy part of tier 2, tier 1, and some people call tier 3 to spinning. So, and in each of these operations, there are sort of different levels of energy consumption and different challenges when you're going to look at the reduction opportunities. And our journey started typically the same way, looking at low-hanging fruit, easy approaches of better energy management, looking at energy efficiency improvement, and changing some of the low-cost equipment which could drive higher energy efficiencies. But some of those opportunities got exhausted. Now what remains on the efficiency side is more high ticket items. So like replacing the whole compressor or replacing the old power looms to go for new generation machines. But yeah, and efficiency work has been an ongoing effort. Only the investment required in that has changed, and paybacks have changed. And I think it is going to be an ongoing effort, because there's a lot of development is now happening at the technology manufacturer end. So the energy is constantly being looked at more importantly by the machine manufacturer themselves, which was not a criteria some years back. So we have now power looms which are 40% more efficient than the existing looms. So, but they are one of the costliest equipment that you have. So, so at what point you make sort of the existing technology obsolete, or when the payback exceeds sort of acceptable norms. But I think one thing is for sure. So at least for all the new equipment as an industry or as a collective, we should make sure that we go for most efficient machines and not the older versions, which are of course still available and which are cheaper for a manufacturer to buy. So some sort of norms or ratings there would certainly help assess the manufacturers who are putting new capacities. Second is in terms of renewable energy, and I think there typically also has been the journey has been same. So we started with doing things which are more in-house. So we started with solar rooftops, covered practically all the usable roof space. We now have 24 megawatt of solar rooftops. And I think I can say broadly about South Asia, the solar rooftops are now very affordable, and they are in most cases they are lower energy cost than your grid energy cost. So it makes immediate sense to do. But in the second part, we do still have challenges. So buying renewable energy is still not very easy, and depending on where you are in Asia, there's still regulations which are lacking, or there's still, because in most of the country, government owns the utility, so they want to protect the existing utility business, which is mostly non-renewable. So there are restrictions put in place on how much energy you can buy through open access from independent power producers. But recently we got some breakthrough in that. So we were doing a very large off-site solar and wind hybrid project along with a developer. So we would take care of some of these challenges. And the most difficult part is, of course, coal and solid fuel, elimination of solid fuel, because typically, if we talk only about tier 2, then our heat requirements are much larger as compared to power. And in some countries like India, coal is the only sort of fuel that we don't even have gas, so to say, for use in the industrial processes. And there, the journey has been hardest. We've been trying to use different type of agriculture waste, agriculture residues, and some of you might have also heard about the problem of pollution due to burning of crop waste in open fields in India. So we are trying to marry the two problems of sort of air pollution due to uncontrolled crop burning, and trying to integrate it within our fuel mix to sort of avoid coal. So we are trying to set up a reverse supply chain of biomass. We're working with agriculture systems in India to collect those biomass from the small fields, setting up some of the briquetting plants in those regions, and our sort of experience of working with cotton farmers has come handy there. So we are able to do it more readily. We did a large pilot with about 10,000 tons of biomass, which we collected this season from agriculture waste. And it was avoided being set on fire in open field, thereby causing less air pollution. Now we are using it in more controlled environment in the boilers. And this has given us a lot of confidence to do it even at much larger scale, at hundreds of thousands of tons scale. And we are collaborating, or we are trying to collaborate with one of our brand partners who's going to partly fund the whole initiative as part of their scope 3 emission reductions, and putting up a new boiler which can run on 100% biomass. So I think solutions do exist for each of the problem areas. We also working on an innovative solar steam generation project where we although that one is still at smaller scale, but we are trying to see a steam generation possibility directly using solar thermal technology. Overall, if you see, we've achieved about 18 to 20% reduction so far from a 2016-17 baseline. That's when we started some of these initiatives, and we're confident of doing 45% by 2025, and then going beyond that if some of the regulations permit by 2030, going way beyond that. So and most of the critical sort of challenges are related to investment. So not everybody is able to invest, and there are also innovative solutions around investment. As a manufacturer, you always don't need to invest. There are large renewable energy companies who are now there to invest, of course, based on your balance sheet and your ability to pay them for power supplied over number of years. But in India, these things have become very popular and much easier, I would say, than it was about 3 or 4 years back. We are able to, right now, the project that I mentioned, we're working on about 60 megawatts of solar and wind, and with a very little investment, about 10% only coming from our wind and rest coming from third-party investors. So some of these things I think we need to leverage. If 100% needs to come from the manufacturer, it would be a very slow process and progress. And we also, there's a lot of opportunities of collaborating with the supply chain, within the supply chain, and also with the brands, which we are doing for the biomass project, where brand is investing into one of our facilities to generate biomass, energy from biomass. So I think the work during last few years have given us a lot of hope that these challenges are surmountable, and also within the defined time limits or the time budget that we have from the science right now. Thanks.
Thank you, Abhishek. A couple key things come to mind. One is I think we need to do a case study on all the various ways in which you're approaching this work. And so let's talk about that, because I think there's a wealth of knowledge and information that you just shared that would be great to actually kind of dive into and something to share with the industry. And then secondly, you allude a lot to finance, and I just want to make a plug that we'll be coming back in June with another webinar on the size of the prize, which is based on the report that we developed with HSBC and Fashion for Good on the unlocking the $1 trillion opportunity. So I think we'll be tapping this panel again for at least insights as we develop out some key on that. But I know there were some, Michael, I think you wanted to chime in a little bit on some of the comments you heard.
Just really a question before we get to Manuel, and Manuel, you can opine on this too. But when Liam was speaking, and then Kurt, Liam, you mentioned that mills can hit 45% roughly through known measures and technology. What are the things that maybe get in the way of a mill doing that? So I can't imagine it's that easy to hit 45%. So like when you talk to mills, and Abhishek, you can speak to this too, maybe like, what are the things that mills that see getting in the way of taking those steps?
I can take a first pass at that, and then hand it over to the other panelists. One of the biggest factors is competing initiatives or competing objectives. And in a lot of cases, even though there's a clear business case for the interventions that a facility might deploy, they're competing with other activities that facility may take on, like adding a new production line, adding a new capability, or a possibility that for revenue driving activities for that particular facility. So that's the first one that comes to mind, and one that we often hear as well. Now, there's certainly an opportunity for an and conversation, doing both the revenue driving activities and the potential efficiency and savings activities as well. But ultimately that comes with a lot of conversation, and kind of leans into a bit more of the psychological side of the programmatic work that we've done historically to ensure that there's a clear display of benefits, both in revenue driving, efficiency driving, and carbon reduction activities for the facilities that we work with. Liam, do you want to expand on that or care to comment?
Yeah, I mean, I think a big mill is a complex operation, and it's difficult, right? And so, especially if you've got a large thermal system, and I think a lot of mills are in tier 2, so they may not see the customer that often. So if the customer's not really prioritizing it, and it's difficult, it's not a priority a lot of the time. So I think that's one simple issue right there. And so I think a lot of suppliers will wait for the customer to really articulate that this is a priority, and try to understand, well, how is that going to affect our business relationship before they start, making it a big commercial issue amongst all the other things that these guys are trying to manage. And don't forget, we've been through a very, very challenging market in the last few years. So I think that's one issue. Yeah, and then I think the second one is, to Abhishek's point, some of this stuff is expensive. So certainly coal phase out for some suppliers, especially if they've recently invested in some coal infrastructure, that's going to be a very, very expensive sort of switch for them to make. And it's not something you would do under normal business conditions. And so, what is going to change there to facilitate those investments? That's a question I don't think we've really run into yet, but we're going to have to get stuck into that fairly quickly.
Awesome. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks. Well, I think I'd like to hear from a brand perspective, and so Manuel, thank you for joining us as well too. And I know that Levi Strauss has a deep relationship with its suppliers, and that you all actively work on these many issues, but specifically as we're talking about energy today. Tell us a little bit about how you're approaching this facility level work to implement any of these energy related emission reduction strategies, and what you're seeing as sort of the opportunities and the challenges.
All right. Well, there is a lot of commonality. I've heard a lot of things. I mean, in the previous conversations that we are working on it, and as well we've been working with NRDC at the early times, and now with CLP as well. So we know from the core the program. So let me just to summarize probably about 5 to 6 building blocks or work streams that we are working on. And the first one is long-term commitment, and with our sourcing base. I think this is critical when you set targets for 2025 and beyond. I think that's a very, very important part of the work. I mean, the purchasing practices piece. I mean, how are you going to engage with the sourcing base and the mills, and how that prioritization is going to look like. Now we can say that probably, and has been mentioned already, our focus on wet processing, meaning laundries and mills, and probably represents up to 50 plus 60% of our footprint, and that's something that is in there. The second big bucket is always pilot to scale. I mean, it's complex. I mean, we are not talking about programs that is a plug and play and you can get results easily. I mean, there are a lot of corners, a lot of technicalities, a lot of complexities you need to deal with, and that's what we did back. And later on, I can develop a little bit more in 2016 when we start piloting deeper on these topics. Partnerships, and that's something that is very important. I mean, having the right partners that they have the expertise and the vision to do this. And now we are doing I'm doing with some of them and here in this call, and probably one of the core things that the fourth point is on the technical assessments, or on the efficiency and revenue efficiency, renewable energy, and I can double them a little bit more on this point, and financing. The last one is going to be financing. So let me go a little bit more in detail in one of those 5, because at the end of the day there is not a silver bullet that you can use. As a combination of those, and it depends a lot of the geography that you're operating, how advanced is that supplier, what is your leverage from a business point of view. So there are quite a lot of things behind that plays in terms of how you can run your program, and it's quite a well. You need to be very attentive and on the context that you are dealing with in order to run the program. So I'm not going to go into the weeds, but let me stop a little bit of giving you a little bit of background and reinforce the point that back when we did our first tests in 2016, one of the conclusions is that with the mills that we tested and laundries in Bangladesh, India, Sri Lanka, and Vietnam, is that we were able to gain energy efficiency gains by up to 20% in some of the cases, and even $1 million savings. And again, we are talking about the initial, and it was, but there are several opportunities there. And even if there is a level of investment, I think it's important to reinforce that, yes, it's in there. Partnerships, I mean, I think that we've been already talking about it, so I'm going to move more into the technical assessment. I mean, what it means at the factory level, what we do once we start engaging with the suppliers, and basically our train of thought is how we can create the conditions to support the suppliers to develop those plans by themselves. So basically how they can get that flexibility to decide which emission reductions they can target. I mean, we are not going to tell them what to do, but through this process, they will discover, oh, I should invest in here, and there, and that could be, and lead them into actions. That's critical for us. And as I mentioned before, the context on country, in which country are you operating, regional context, and one important point is how advanced is that supplier in their efficiency, or in this journey. I mean, because we can go from 3 levels, at least we work in 3 levels. The very basic one, when you just get some gains and some initial quick wins where they can realize, oh wow, this is something, I mean, it's workable and I can start the journey, to what we call in-depth interventions, which basically is just going with an energy and water and deep dive assessments and technical assessments on site. And what we call a third layer, which is what we call customized approach, which basically are suppliers like Arvin, for example, when they have a long journey. So in this case, the conversation is going to be different. It's like, okay, well, how we can collaborate in any specific project or an area that you need. So we are always breaking all of this in those three levels that lead us in interventions, that lead us into having a conversation with our supplier on reduction targets and how those targets align. And I'm thinking about our whole supply chain into the bigger target, and on our scope 3, how all of this comes together. And from there, we develop roadmaps. This is something that we started a couple of years ago, and it's been quite intense, but I think it has been, I mean, it's been very helpful to have that level of engagement and to bring that long-term engagement with our supply base. Those roadmaps is basically about understanding how many locations does this vendor, what is our tangible, I mean, what is our volume? I mean, our product, what is produced? You have some vendors that they have 3, 4, 5, 6 different factories. Which ones are they? Which data are we talking about? What is the quality of the data that we are getting? What are the past projects, and also what are their their future investments? That's another area that you need to really have that conversation, and it's quite intensive. And as well, we perform at renewable energy. I mean, if there is an opportunity to have it in-house, or you need to go to the market in order to buy. Let me stop here because we have only 10 minutes more and I can keep going. And this is the point about financing. This is a very, very critical one. And in our case, we have two extremes of work. From one side, we have the Global Trade Supplier Finance Program that we started many years ago with IFC, and now with HSBC, with private as well, where we are putting energy efficiency as a condition if you want to get in that program and you want to get benefits. So basically, with this program, vendors get early payments and a lower annual discount rate. So that's something that is, and basically that is another incentive for them, but this is only one. Now we're in the process of assessing our supply chain and see how, and that's what I meant before saying, well, you need to go country by country in what are those financing models that we can develop in order for our vendors to get much better loans and conditions. And that is very different depending on if you're maybe a supplier in China, or in Singapore, you get a much better access to money than, for example, one in Pakistan. And that's what we are doing right now. And I can say that it's quite intensive. I mean, it still is work in progress, and we will need what AII is doing in terms of bringing the more people we can come together and work together on this, the better. I mean, it is something that a company alone cannot do. So I think that those are one of the initiatives that can bring a lot of value for the industry. And I stop here because I know that otherwise we will have time for questions, for the question section. So back to you, Lewis.
Thank you, Manuel. Michael, I know you had some thoughts that you wanted to bring into some of the questions that have been posed, but also with Manuel's presentation as well.
Yeah, no, so there's some great questions coming in. So please keep sharing them. There's a question from Tony that resonated with something I was going to ask. So Tony asks around tier 2, and he mentions how complex and how tier 2 supplies to multiple tier 1 customers, plus they don't necessarily interact directly with brands, which Liam, you mentioned. Would love thoughts from the panelists, maybe particularly Arvind and Liam. What can a mill do to invest in energy efficiency and renewables? And Kurt, you would have a view here too. When you do have multiple tier 1 customers and you're maybe not seeing a lot of interest from the brands or questions from the brands, and then maybe a follow-up to that, how can brands better tell mills what they need, what they want, and engage in that conversation? So multiple customers for mills, and then how do the brands engage in that conversation?
Yeah, well, I can go first since well, on the mill side, and then I can talk about our model. We and maybe because it's on the denim, it's in a special part of the apparel industry, but we have a contacts with our fabric mills because it's in our best interest. I mean, not only from a sustainability point of view, but from a quality and lead time. So basically, we work with our tier ones to ensure that they use the tier twos, and we know who those tier twos are in order to ensure that, I mean, from a purely business purposes, that they are connected, and that's where we have our leverage. It's true that it's very difficult for a fabric. I mean, when you cannot follow your brand, let's say, I mean, it's not. I mean, a fabric is not branded product. Is when the challenge starts, because you can have several brands and you don't even notice that they are in the same supplier. So I think that's something that transparency, we haven't talked about it, but knowing who is where, that's something that it can be a big plus, because that can bring enough collective, let's say, alignment between the brands in order to talk to those tier ones and tier twos and bring how important is this work. One last point that it can bring, and also, and I think it is just something that everybody knows, but we've been working quite a lot in long-term partnerships, and it's very important how your sourcing strategy looks like. And I mean, if you're trying to get this program and just changing very often in your business partners or your suppliers or your mills, it's not going to work. So you need to build those long-term partnerships, and it's basically a 21st century sourcing strategy that you need to have in place.
Yep. Abhishek, how do you deal with multiple customers? I mean, obviously you're vertically integrated, so you have some of your own garment production, but how do you deal with this issue of maybe multiple brand customers, maybe not hearing from them enough about what's important? I think historically, there's also been a notion of brands set targets and throw them over the wall to their suppliers to figure out, which is not a healthy relationship for the industry. So how do you see it from Arvind's perspective?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely challenging, Michael, if different brands are asking for different things, and especially in context of carbon, what we are seeing is the baseline year. So baseline year, every brand is sort of started using a different baseline year, and they want you to also use that baseline year for setting your targets. And in our case, typically the issue often comes is that we have started taking climate action before sort of climate become a buzzword in the industry, and before the brands started talking about climate as such. So that also becomes challenging to align, where we have to explain that we already achieved 22% emission reductions from a certain baseline year, and where we are in our climate journey. Second challenge that we see also is in some cases we recently had the example of brand asking to reduce 75% emissions, and certain brands saying you just like take a target, we'll figure out later how to implement, or just saying that we just want you to take a target and we'll see if it can be implemented or not, because they have a pressure from head office for all the mills to take a target or to submit a roadmap. So there are many sort of kind of work streams. There are few people who are just trying to do shallow work. Some people are trying in-depth work, working with mills and facilities on improvement plan. So there's all kind of so you need to really be able to distill the noises out of the system, and also have your own plan in place. So the worst thing is if you don't have your own plan in place as a mill, and then you are of course susceptible to 10 different kind of plans coming your way.
Thank you.
I just jump in on one quick last comment on that. By 2030, if we believe the brands are serious about their carbon targets, they can't afford to do volume from high carbon mills. It's not possible.
Mhm.
So from the mill's perspective, I think look at your customer base, look at what they're saying about carbon, and go talk to them and see if they're serious.
Yeah.
And look also at what your business growth strategy is and where you want to be selling volume as we go through the decade. Because if we believe the brands are going to hit these targets, they can't hold high carbon mills for any large amount of volume by 2030. That's what our models are saying anyway.
Mhm. Liam, do you think brands really get that point? It's such a critical point.
No,
Yeah.
not all of them, because lots of them haven't done the modeling yet.
Yeah.
But those that have, and this trend will deepen, can see it very clearly.
Yeah.
Great. And, you know, I think as we're presenting today, you know, the work that both Arvin and Levi's have done, what if I'm a small medium enterprise? Like, how do the SME brand retailers and suppliers do this work? Maybe Liam, anyone, you know, to chime in on that.
This is AII's role to standardize the answers and make them lower the transaction cost of deploying these measures. So build the roadmap, standardize them, collaborate so that it's not one brand to one supplier all the time. And we still don't know how to fix the how are we going to buy the expensive stuff question.
Yeah.
Maybe pay more.
No, that's great. That's great insight. And I think that tees up, you know, Kurt, the work that you're doing, because you're working with brands and retailers across sizes. And so, you know, it's not just the big. Well, I know we're closing in on time. We've had some great questions in the Q&A, and I really appreciate Liam and Michael for diving in to answer all those. It would have been great to have time to talk through all of them, because these were great questions, and they'll obviously be in the recording. We can send out as well too. So with that, any closing comments before we give the time back to our attendees? All right. Well, I appreciate all of you joining today and the continued work that you're doing, both with Apparel Impact Institute, but even all the work that you're doing outside of us as well, too, because it's all critical. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you, WRI, for being a co-host of this, Michael, for being a co-moderator, and to our panelists. Thank you, and have a good day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Cheers. Bye.